Welcome to a place where the line between dreams and nightmares blurs, where shadows come alive and mysteries linger just beyond the light. I'm your guide through this haunting realm, where every whisper tells a story, and every story pulls you deeper into the unknown. Whether you find yourself here at Nightmare Lullabies or with Miss Nightmare, know that you are never truly alone in the dark. The doll in the attic. There was always something wrong with the house on Sycamore Street. The towering Victorian home had sat abandoned for years, its windows dark, its walls thick with rot and shadows. The townspeople avoided it, whispering about its past, about the child who had once lived there, Abigail Turner, and the doll that had consumed her. Some said the house itself was alive, feeding off anyone foolish enough to enter. When Emily and Mark Lawson moved in with their 7-year-old daughter, Lily, they didn't believe in such things. To them, it was just an old house with character, but that was before they found the doll. The attic was the first sign. It was tucked behind a small hidden door that Emily hadn't noticed at first. It was a cold, dead space, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. She felt uneasy the moment she stepped inside, as if the room were watching her. And then she saw the doll. It sat in a wooden rocking chair near the window, its porcelain face cracked and yellowed with age. The eyes were what disturbed Emily the most, glass orbs that were too big, too human, too knowing. They seemed to track her every movement as she crossed the room. She reached out to touch it, her hand shaking. The moment her fingers brushed the doll's brittle lace dress, she felt a sharp, stabbing cold shoot up her arm. The rocking chair moved, not by much, but enough to make her gasp. She snatched her hand back, heart racing, and hurried out of the attic. As she descended the stairs, she could have sworn she heard a soft, distant giggle, like a child's voice echoing through the walls. That night, Emily awoke to the sound of soft scratching. At first, it was faint, just the barest whisper of nails against wood. But then it grew louder, more insistent, until it was like something was scraping directly above their bed. Mark stirred beside her. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He groggily sat up, listening. The scratching stopped. "It's probably mice," he muttered. "This place is old." Emily wasn't convinced. Something about the noise felt wrong. It wasn't random like an animal. It was deliberate. It felt alive. The next day, Lily found the doll. Emily hadn't told her about it, hadn't even mentioned the attic, but somehow Lily knew. She came running down the stairs, clutching the doll in her arms. "Mommy, look what I found! Isn't she beautiful?" Lily's voice was filled with excitement. Emily froze. The doll's cracked face stared up at her from Lily's arms, its glassy eyes glinting in the sunlight. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. "She was in the attic," Lily said. "She told me her name is Annabelle." Emily's blood ran cold. How do you know her name?" Lily smiled sweetly, her grip tightening on the doll. "She told me." That night, everything changed. Lily began speaking to the doll, whispering to it in the dark. Emily would stand outside her daughter's door, listening as Lily had long conversations with Annabelle. At first, it seemed innocent enough. Children often had imaginary friends. But soon, Lily's behavior shifted. She became withdrawn, her once bright eyes dull and glassy. She spent hours alone in her room, just sitting there, staring at the doll. The scratching sounds returned, but now they were louder, coming from all over the house. At night, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallways, small, light footsteps, like a child walking barefoot on the wooden floors. Each time Emily tried to find the source, she would come across Annabelle, sitting in random places, propped up as though someone had deliberately placed her there. Once, she found the doll standing in the corner of the living room, facing the wall. The sight of it made her stomach churn. When she asked Lily if she had moved the doll, Lily just smiled and said, "Annabelle likes to walk around at night." Emily began having vivid nightmares. In them, she saw Abigail Turner, the little girl who had once lived in the house. Abigail was always hanging from the rafters in the attic, her lifeless body swinging gently back and forth. But the worst part was that the doll was always there, sitting at Abigail's feet, its eyes gleaming with a twisted satisfaction. Each time Emily woke, she could still hear the creaking of the rope in her mind, the doll's eyes lingering in the darkness of her room. Things escalated further when Mark, skeptical of his wife's growing paranoia, decided to get rid of the doll. One night, while Lily was sleeping, he took the doll from her room and locked it in the basement. For the first time in weeks, Emily felt a sense of relief. Maybe it was just a doll after all. Maybe they were overreacting. But at 3 a.m., they woke to the sound of heavy footsteps thudding up the stairs. Emily's heart stopped. She grabbed Mark's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Do you hear that?" The footsteps were slow, deliberate. They moved down the hallway, closer and closer to their bedroom. And then they stopped, right outside their door. Mark jumped out of bed, threw the door open and froze. There, standing in the hallway, was the doll. Annabelle's face was tilted upward, her wide, lifeless eyes staring directly at him. Her hands were raised, her fingers splayed out, as if she had been reaching for the doorknob. And behind her, etched into the wooden floor, were long, jagged scratches, as if she had crawled up the stairs on her own. Emily screamed. Mark grabbed the doll, his face pale with terror, and threw it out of the house, into the trash. They stayed awake all night, listening to every creak, every whisper of the wind. They thought it was over. They thought they had escaped the nightmare. But the next morning, when Emily went to check on Lily, she found her daughter sitting at the foot of her bed, her eyes blank, her face pale. "Mommy," Lily whispered. "Annabelle's back. She told me she's never going to leave us." Emily's throat tightened. She slowly turned and saw the doll sitting in the rocking chair, just as it had been when she first found it. But something was different now. The doll's eyes weren't just glass anymore, they were real, human. And they were watching her, unblinking, cold as death. Lily stood up, her movements stiff, unnatural. She held the doll in her arms, her gaze distant. "Annabelle said she wants to play with you now." Emily backed away, her mind racing. "Lily, put the doll down. Now." But Lily didn't respond. Instead, she lifted the doll's hand and placed it against her cheek. "She's mine now, Mommy. And soon, I'll be hers." Emily tried to run, but the door slammed shut behind her. The air grew thick and heavy, and she heard the giggling again, louder this time, coming from the walls, from the very house itself. The last thing Emily saw before everything went dark was the doll's face twisting into a grin, its porcelain skin cracking wide to reveal a gaping black void beneath. And in that void, she saw something writhing, something ancient and hungry, waiting to consume her. The house stands empty now, once again abandoned. But late at night, if you stand on the sidewalk and listen carefully, you can hear the faint sound of a child laughing. Some say it's Lily, others say it's Annabelle. But those who know the truth never speak of it, because some stories are better left untold. Now, no one dares to go near the house on Sycamore Street. But sometimes, on especially dark nights, people swear they see a little girl standing in the attic window, clutching a doll. And if you look too long, they say, you'll see the doll look back. The nightmare that followed me. For 7 nights straight, Amanda had the same nightmare. It began like any dream, ordinary, mundane. But then, things twisted. Each time the images grew clearer, more vivid, and the feeling of something dark lurking just beyond the edges became more pronounced. What started as a hazy dream turned into something far worse, a premonition that seemed to tighten its grip with every night. The last dream was the worst. In it, Amanda stood alone on an empty road. It was night, but the sky was strangely absent, no stars, no moon, just a blank, suffocating blackness pressing down on her. The fog rolled in thick waves, and the only thing visible was a flickering street lamp in the distance. It pulsed like a dying heartbeat, casting eerie shadows that danced unnaturally along the pavement. Amanda's breath was shallow, each exhale fogging in the cold, still air. There was a sense of wrongness in the atmosphere, something tangible, as if the very air was sick. She wasn't alone, though she saw no one. And then, like every night before, she heard the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and agonizingly steady. The sound echoed through the fog, sending a chill racing down her spine. Amanda's body tensed, but she couldn't move. She didn't dare look behind her. She already knew what she'd see. The man, a looming figure, tall and gaunt, barely visible in the thick haze. His eyes, glowing with a dull, sinister light, fixed on her. They were too bright, too aware for something that should only exist in a dream. His smile, stretched far too wide across his pale, decayed face, was an impossibility, a grotesque grin that sent shivers of revulsion through her. He raised his hand, pointing directly at her, his long fingers curling slowly, beckoning her to come closer. But she didn't want to. Every fiber of her being screamed to run, to wake up. And yet she couldn't. She felt paralyzed, like some invisible force was holding her in place, pushing down on her lungs, making it harder to breathe. In a sickeningly slow motion, he began to walk toward her, his footsteps pounding in her head like the ticking of a death clock. The fog parted around him like it feared his presence, revealing more of his distorted body. He moved unnaturally, his limbs bending in ways that shouldn't be possible, as if his joints were dislocated, broken. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her legs finally obeyed her, and she ran. The road stretched endlessly before her, no landmarks, no escape. The man was always just behind her, his breath hot on her neck. And no matter how fast she ran, the gap between them never widened. Then, just as it always did, she tripped. She hit the ground hard, the asphalt cutting into her palms, blood smearing the surface. But her eyes widened in terror as she saw that the blood was spreading, darkening the road, moving with a life of its own. It was pulling her down, seeping into her skin like thick black oil. The man's fingers brushed the back of her neck, cold and sharp like ice, sending a violent shiver through her body. His breath was hot and rotten as he leaned close to her ear. "Soon," he whispered in a voice like the hiss of wind through dead trees. "Soon." Amanda woke screaming, her sheets tangled around her body, drenched in cold sweat. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she was safe, in her bed, the room around her quiet. The nightmare clung to her, though the images far too clear for just a dream. She could still feel the pressure of his hand on her neck. She glanced at the clock. 3:33 a.m. The same time she'd woken every night for the past week. It wasn't a coincidence anymore. Amanda sat up, trying to shake off the lingering terror, but the feeling of dread refused to leave. Her house was quiet, too quiet. She couldn't shake the sensation that someone was watching her. By the time the sun finally rose, Amanda felt like a ghost. Her hands trembled as she poured coffee, her mind playing tricks on her. Out of the corner of her eye, she thought she saw movement in the hallway, a shadow that didn't belong. The sound of soft footsteps followed her through the house, but every time she turned, she saw nothing. She told herself it was just her nerves. The dream had rattled her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, she locked every window and door in the house. Even though it was ridiculous, Amanda couldn't help but glance outside, expecting to see him waiting for her. Her phone buzzed on the counter, startling her. She checked it, her heart skipping a beat. A message flashed across the screen from an unknown number. "See you soon." Amanda's stomach lurched. It had to be a prank, someone messing with her. But deep down, she knew better. Her hands shook as she deleted the message, trying to convince herself it was nothing. That night, Amanda dreamed again. But this time, something was different. The road was darker, the fog thicker, and the man, he was closer, his face more detailed, more monstrous. His skin hung loosely from his bones, like it had rotted away over centuries. His teeth, sharp and too numerous, gleamed as his smile stretched grotesquely wide. This time when she ran, she felt the pull of the road under her feet, like something was alive beneath it, grasping at her legs, trying to drag her down. The air grew thick, her lungs burning with every breath. As she ran, she heard him laughing low, guttural, inhuman. She tripped again, but this time, when she fell, the man's hand clamped around her ankle. His grip was like iron, dragging her toward him as she kicked and screamed. The road was swallowing her, the asphalt splitting open like the maw of some monstrous creature. Her screams echoed in the vast emptiness as he whispered in her ear, "You can't escape me." Amanda woke, gasping for breath, her throat raw from screaming. But something was wrong. Her sheets were on the floor, and the air in her room was freezing. The windows, every single one, were wide open, and on the wall, written in a smeared, oily black substance, were the words, "I'm here." Amanda knew she couldn't stay in the house. She packed a bag and drove to a motel on the outskirts of town, desperate to escape the nightmare. But as the sun set, she felt it again, that sinking dread, that sense that no matter where she went, she couldn't outrun him. That night, in the sterile quiet of the motel room, she dreamed again. The same road, the same fog. But this time, when she woke up, it wasn't to safety, it was to darkness. Amanda sat up, her breath shallow, her heart racing. The motel room was gone. She was standing in the middle of the road, the fog swirling around her feet. The street lamp flickered, casting long, twisting shadows across the cracked pavement. Behind her, she heard the familiar footsteps, slow, deliberate. She turned, tears streaming down her face, knowing what she would see. The man was there, his glowing eyes locked onto hers, his smile wider than ever. He raised his hand, pointing at her as the fog thickened around them, suffocating, pressing in from all sides. "No," she whispered, backing away. "This isn't real. This isn't real." But his smile said otherwise. He stepped toward her, the road cracking beneath his feet. The fog swirled faster, darker, and Amanda felt herself being pulled into it, into the darkness, into the nightmare. This time, she wouldn't wake up. His voice echoed in her mind, low and taunting. "You can't wake up if you never left the dream." When the motel manager came to check on her the next morning, Amanda was gone. The room was empty, except for a single message written on the mirror in black, oily letters. "You can't escape me." Amanda's story is one of many. They say that if you dream of the man with the glowing eyes, you'll never truly wake up again. The nightmare will follow you, and no matter how far you run, he'll always be just a step behind. The empty house. It had been 3 days since Emma's parents left. They'd gone out to dinner, a rare night away, leaving Emma home alone. She was 16, old enough to stay by herself, but as the clock struck midnight and they still weren't home, the house felt unnaturally quiet. The first night she brushed it off. Maybe they stayed late somewhere, got held up. Her mom and dad would explain it all when they got home. But as the hours dragged on, a gnawing unease settled in. She had sent texts, left voicemails, but no replies came. Their phones went straight to voicemail. By the morning, the silence was crushing. The house was always full of noise when her parents were there, distant conversation, the clink of dishes in the kitchen, the hum of the TV. Now it was just her, and the stillness that seemed to deepen with every hour. She wandered from room to room, trying to distract herself, but everything felt off. The ticking of the wall clock felt too loud. The refrigerator hummed just a little too long, and the wind outside rattled the windows like it was trying to get in. She called the restaurant they had gone to, but they said her parents had left hours earlier. There were no car accidents reported on the highway, no disturbances in town. They had just vanished. Day 4 came and went. The food in the fridge started going bad. Emma couldn't bring herself to throw it out, though it felt too final. Instead, she just closed the fridge and ignored the growing stench, as if pretending everything was normal would somehow make it so. She tried calling friends, but they didn't understand. They probably just took a little vacation, they said. You're overthinking it. Their words sounded hollow, disinterested. But Emma knew her parents. They wouldn't leave without a word. They wouldn't just disappear. The days blurred together. By day 5, Emma started losing track of time. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping. Every creak of the house made her jump. Shadows flickered in her peripheral vision, but when she turned to look, nothing was there. The house was empty, or so she thought. On the 6th day, she found their car. She had woken up in the early morning, her heart pounding from a nightmare she couldn't quite remember. The house was too quiet, the air too still, like it was waiting for something to happen. When she stepped out onto the front porch, there it was, her parents' car, sitting in the driveway, covered in a thin layer of dust, as if it had been sitting there for days. The doors were locked. The keys were still in the ignition, but there was no sign of her parents. Emma's skin crawled as she circled the car, her mind racing. How long had it been there? She had walked past the driveway 100 times in the last week, and it had never been there before. She was sure of it. She would have noticed, wouldn't she? She backed away from the car, her pulse quickening. Something was terribly wrong. This wasn't normal. None of this was normal. She ran back into the house, locking the door behind her. She pulled out her phone, dialing the police for the 100th time, but as the call connected, all she heard was static. White noise hissing in her ear like someone breathing on the other end of the line. She hung up and tried again, but the same thing happened. Her phone wasn't working. By day 7, Emma was starting to lose it. She couldn't sleep anymore. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard things moving in the house, footsteps upstairs, the creak of floorboards that hadn't shifted in years. She was alone. She had checked every room, every closet, but the noises never stopped. The house felt different now, like it was alive. The walls groaned, the air was thick, suffocating. Shadows seemed to move on their own, lengthening across the walls, following her as she moved from room to room. She swore she saw shapes, dark figures lurking just out of sight, but when she blinked, they were gone. On the 8th night, something changed. Emma was sitting on the couch, staring at the TV, not really watching. The static was on the cable had gone out days ago. She was numb, her mind buzzing with exhaustion. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A flash of movement. She turned her head slowly, her breath catching in her throat. The hallway that led to her parents' bedroom was dark, but for just a second, she saw something, a figure standing at the end of the hall, watching her. Tall, silent, its face shrouded in shadow. She blinked, and it was gone. Emma stood, her heart pounding so loud she could hear it in her ears. She moved toward the hallway, every instinct telling her to turn back, to run. But she couldn't stop. She had to see. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, the walls narrowing, pressing in on her as she walked. The shadows flickered, twisting unnaturally as if the house itself was warping around her. When she reached her parents' bedroom, the door was ajar, just enough for her to see inside. The room was dark, but in the dim light she could make out two figures. They were sitting on the bed, backs to her, completely still. Her parents. A wave of relief washed over her. "Mom? Dad?" Her voice was hoarse, trembling, but they didn't respond. "Where have you been?" No answer. She took a step closer. The air in the room was cold, unnaturally so, and the smell something sour, like rot, hung in the air. She moved toward them slowly, her heart thudding in her chest. "Mom? Dad?" And then they turned. Their faces were wrong. Skin pale, lips drawn back in a twisted, hollow smile, eyes wide and vacant, as if staring at something far, far away. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like puppets being pulled by invisible strings. Emma's breath caught in her throat as they stood in unison, their heads tilting at odd angles. They took a step toward her, their movements too slow, too deliberate. She stumbled back, her legs trembling, but they kept coming. "Why did you leave me?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Her mother's head snapped to the side, too fast, the bones in her neck cracking. "We never left," she said in a voice that wasn't her own. It was distorted, low and guttural, like it came from somewhere deep beneath the earth. "We've always been here." Her father's hand reached out, fingers gnarled, gray, too long. "Come with us." Emma backed out of the room, heart racing, slamming the door shut behind her. She ran down the hallway, but the house felt like it was closing in on her, the walls shifting, growing darker, tighter. Shadows crawled along the floor, reaching for her, twisting into familiar shapes, her parents' faces, twisted in grotesque, unnatural grins. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the door to the outside growing farther and farther away. She could hear them behind her now, their footsteps slow and deliberate, following her. "You can't leave," her mother's voice echoed through the walls, distorted and wrong. "You'll never leave." Emma reached the front door, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the lock. She yanked the door open and ran outside, the cold night air hitting her like a slap to the face. The street was empty, silent. The world outside the house felt eerily calm. But something wasn't right. The car was still in the driveway, but the street was different. The houses around her seemed wrong, distorted, like they were painted on a backdrop. The sky was too dark, too still, and the air carried a suffocating weight. And then she realized she wasn't really outside. The house had never let her go. A shadow passed over her, and she turned to see them, her parents, standing on the porch, their faces still twisted in that grotesque smile. Their voices echoed in her head, a low, insistent whisper that made her skin crawl. "Come inside, Emma. You'll never be alone again." She turned to run, but the world around her crumbled, the ground beneath her feet giving way as the darkness closed in. And in the distance, she heard their voices one last time, a chilling echo that would haunt her forever. "You never left. We were always with you." Emma's parents never truly left the house, and now, neither will she. No one knows what happened to her, but if you listen closely, some say you can still hear the sound of footsteps in that empty, dark hallway. The darkness fades and the quiet settles in. You've wandered through another shadowed tale, leaving behind echoes of fear and fragments of mystery. But remember, the night never truly ends here. Whenever you close your eyes, these stories linger, waiting in the stillness, just beyond the edge of sleep. Until next time, when you dare to return to nightmare lullabies, or perhaps find yourself with Miss Nightmare, where your darkest dreams will once again be whispered into the night.